Good afternoon to our CLA family members, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our live stream. We sincerely hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy at this time. We have had breaking news all over the place this past week. So you may have heard a little rumor that a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package went through Congress this week, and it was actually just signed by President Biden today, right before we started the live stream. So we're going to be spending next Thursday really diving deep and unpacking several provisions of that bill and how they apply to both you and your business. So that is going to be an episode that you want to mark your calendar for and not miss. But that's not all. We have more breaking news to cover today. We have been talking for several weeks now about the interplay from the last relief bill that we have related to the PPP and the employee retention credit. And let's just say that that is super complicated. The IRS has issued much anticipated guidance last week, over 102 pages worth related to this. So we've got Jen Rowan with us today to break that down for us. So welcome, Jen.
Thanks, Leslie. It's great to be here.
We also have Todd Sprang, and he is going to be talking about some of the latest PPP developments. So Todd, great to have you back with us.
Thanks, Leslie.
Now, before we dive in today, we do have some housekeeping that we want to cover. We do have the ability for live Q&A again during our session. In order to participate, you have to log in and register using that link below me. Those questions are going to appear for you, and you are going to have the ability to like those, to move those up in priority so that we can address those. We have moderators that are standing by, including your favorite, Jack Rybicki, who is ready to engage and interact with you. So get those questions in. We also wanted to let you know of a couple special events that we've got coming up. We have our financial health webinar series for individuals that kicks off on March 17th. And that first session is going to be tax planning for investors, which is a great topic in light of all of this Biden tax reform that's happening. So check that out. Additionally, we have numerous industry-specific sessions all throughout March on our events page, including technology on March 18th, K through 12 on March 23rd, and on the 24th, we have two industry events. We have a healthcare event and a dealership event. So you can register for all of these events on our website. Now, in addition to all of these events, again, be on the lookout for articles and white papers. But as always, contact your CLA professional because we absolutely want to talk to you and engage with you. So with all of that backdrop, we are going to start with Jen. And Jen, I know today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that new IRS notice, but we would be absolutely remiss if we don't start with the big change that happened with this new bill. So this new bill had a little bit of breaking news related to the retention credit, related to expansion of the timeline of the retention credit. And I don't want to steal your thunder, so why don't you tell me what this big exciting news is?
I will. I'll start with that because, Leslie, as you know, there's usually nothing more than I love than a live stream. What I really love is a legislative live stream. So this is a fun one. So happy to start the conversation with some good news for organizations. The new bill extends the employee retention credit through the end of 2021. So what we're planning to originally discuss as it relates to 2 quarters of 2021. We now are extending through all 4 quarters of 2021. So for those of you who are doing the math in your head, it could be up to $28,000 in credit per eligible employee, assuming you qualify every quarter for that retention credit. So that's exciting news. And I know we'll unpack that a little bit more next week and in the coming weeks. The other thing that's super exciting is for those people who are still making payments under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Now, those are not mandatory and they were not made mandatory, which they thought they might be. You also get that payroll tax credit through September 30th, which initially we were only going to be able to take through the end of this quarter or the end of this month. So that's good news that came from it. And then there are a lot of other provisions, as it relates to recovery startup businesses. There's something in there for severely financially distressed employers. So lots of little nuggets there. We even have a little bit more on the interplay with SBA loans. And initially we had only heard about, ERC and PPP, and you couldn't double dip. We got a little bit more clarity in the legislation, but still no frequently asked questions, still no notices, still no guidance or forms to unpack it. But the law says they have to do that. So hopefully we'll get deeper into that.
Well, I mean, overall, I think that is really great news. And I know you're going to be spending a lot of time doing some reading this week to be getting us all up to speed and putting out some thought leadership. So thank you for that. But, I think let's go back to the fact that we also got breaking news last week. So last week we began to touch on it with Jack, and that is that we mentioned Notice 21-20, which was much anticipated and really helped convey an important message around putting pause on forgiveness with the PPP application potentially. So part of that was because there is sometimes in 2020 an important interplay with the PPP and the retention credit. But there can be more considerations than just this interplay. So tell me a little bit about why Jack might have conveyed pressing pause on this particular issue.
Well, sure. So, I mean, a lot of what Jack was talking about was if you've already filed for forgiveness, the notice did address those various areas where, or scenarios in which, depending on what you put in your forgiveness application, you could carve out ERC wages. So that's why he was saying, look, press pause. If you haven't filed it already, let's see if we can really identify those expenses to get to that 40%. Let's free up whatever payroll we can, because what that notice did then was give us some information and a little bit more clarity about how in 2020 an organization could qualify for the credit.
Okay, and so this is really interesting because I heard you just say 2020. So is that intentional that that's what you said?
Yes, it is. And I wish I wish it were a different answer, but this notice is strictly designed to answer questions about the employee retention credit in 2020. We still don't have guidance about 2021 other than the new law, right? That's telling us now you have the credit for all 4 quarters in 2021, and there's guidance to come. There is a lot that we can extrapolate from the notice, but that was such a great catch because the notice is limited to 2020. So things could still change as people are reaching out to their advisors, to payroll providers, as they're trying to figure it out. Do I qualify in 2021? In a lot of cases, you need to wait and see, especially if it's gray, because that notice doesn't give you clarity in those gray areas.
Yeah, so tell me what's in that notice because I know you were reading all 102 of those pages cover to cover, and you read it multiple times, by golly.
I totally have. That's what I do, Leslie, as you know. So anyway, and that said, I say that jokingly, but I also say it with a lot of sincerity too. Like, so we've read it, we've unpacked it, and I want to just take some time on what the notice does. So a lot of it is a reiteration of the FAQs, the way these notices work and the way the FAQs work, right? So you've got the law, you've got FAQs that are not binding legal authority, and they can help us, but they're just posted on the IRS website. What the notice does is it puts things in it. The notice actually is recorded in the Federal Register, so it's a little bit more binding legal authority. So that restatement of the FAQs that we already know is helpful to have in the notice because you get a little bit more comfortable than relying on what you've looked up on the IRS website when you've got questions. So a lot of that notice was just a reiteration of things that we knew. Gross receipts are determined under 448C unless you're tax exempt, and it's 6033. I mean, we've got a lot of things that we kind of already knew, but this did give clarity, and it did give us an objective test around a partial shutdown, which we needed that information so much, and then what it means to try to define if an organization could telework. So at least we got data around that can help us unpack it a little bit better, and then some examples to help give us some clarity.
Yeah, and so I think that's important for the viewers to understand, right? Because one of the key tests here might be that you had some type of a shutdown. And so let's start with, what is that objective test around a partial shutdown? Because I think that's been squishy, to say the least.
Squishy is the great word for it. I love hearing you say that because it's true, right? And remember, there are two ways you can qualify for the employee retention credit, and this gets confusing for people too. It's either fully or partially suspended by the government order, or you have this reduction in gross receipts. It's not required that you have both, and I think that even caused some problem. But to get to this partial shutdown, if that's how you're planning on qualifying, we at least have a more objective test than we did. It still has to be a legitimate government order. We're still not talking about guidelines. But what the objective test says is that the gross receipts from that portion of the business has to be not less than 10% of the total gross receipts of the business at the same period in 2019. So whatever's affected by the order has to be more than 10% of the gross receipts of the business. In the alternative, you could also look at the hours of service performed by employees in that portion of the business that are shut down. They can't be less than 10% of the total number of hours of service performed by all employees of the business. So that at least helps you say, okay, if something was shutting me down, was it more than 10% of either my gross receipts compared to what I was making money on in 2019? Or was it based on the hours of things that I had people doing in 2019 during that same period? So at least we have that. It's a 10% number. We're looking at sales and we're looking at hours.
Okay, so I think that's good. It kind of puts a box around it, but I also think it can be helpful to give people maybe a couple tangible examples here, because examples are always worth more than these legal jargons that we put around things. So what are a couple examples here to help paint a picture for people?
Great question. So, and the examples are wonderful, and there are quite a few, so I'm not going to do that all here, but one good example was the grocery store salad bar. So you could legitimately say, hey, we've got a partial shutdown because you can't do salad bars, and with the salad bar, they had transitioned to filling the salad bar with prepared foods, but in no grocery store, I don't want to say a no because somebody's going to find the exception, but in most grocery stores, the salad bar, even though it was shut down and we had to change that, that's not 10% of the gross receipts typically of the grocery store, nor is it 10% of the hours that the employees overall perform in their work. So the IRS said, look, that is not a partial shutdown. The other thing that's not a partial shutdown, they kept at the retail operations because I think that affected a lot of people. And I do think there's a lot of opportunity in the retail space for the employee retention credit. So it's important that we keep that in mind. But one thing they also said was, look, if people had to stand outside in line to get into a business, but ultimately when they were in there, there was enough room for them to continue to do their shopping, that inconvenience of waiting in line for 10 to 30 minutes or whatever it took to get into the retail store, the big box store, is also not considered a partial shutdown, even though we had a limitation of the number of people who could be in one place. So I think that surprised some folks who were being more aggressive about taking it, but it was helpful to know because it's like, okay, so that 10% is not going to, that salad bar or waiting in line is not going to meet that 10% restriction. So I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, I think those are really good examples because it really does make you think twice about whether or not you really meet those tests.
Mhm.
And so the other thing that could be a little bit complicated is, again, if you had the ability to telework, then you might not have qualified even in a government shutdown. And there are certainly transition periods when you're setting up a telework system. And they did give good examples around how that might have factored into this. So talk a little bit about the whole telework scenario as well as transition considerations related to that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was the other really key area that they dove into in the notice. So they said, could you have comparable operations or did you have the ability to telework? And a lot of times, I even was on the phone with clients who were saying, well, we never really did before. And that doesn't matter. And that's been clarified in the notice. So if they have the ability to telework, if the work was portable to the employee's home or a different location, meaning they could adapt, there was no need for presence in the employer's physical workspace. For instance, if everything you did at a desk you could do either remotely or by traveling to a location, you could probably do that then from your home. They did clarify though that, if I'm a physical therapist office and all my equipment that I need to do my work is in my office, then of course that's going to qualify as an inability to telework, right? And then to your point, and the wise thing that you said earlier was the IRS then said, is the adjustment period to telework significant? And by significant, they meant more than 2 weeks. They said, look, in the notice, they said, look, it's reasonable to expect that it is going to take a couple days to get everybody up and running. But if it takes more than 2 weeks, you can look at that period of time that it takes to get everybody outfitted to work from home or in a comparable telework situation. You can take that time and consider it a partial shutdown, but beyond that, then you can't. So those were some really, really wonderful clarifying points as far as measuring out what is the ability to telework, as opposed to, again, the loose interpretation of, what we never did before. And, doesn't that then mean that we were shut down?
Yeah, and I think the notice had probably a couple good examples, even on companies that might have been able to telework and do it very seamlessly. So maybe providing an example of that for the viewers would be good as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the notice gave the example of a software company. And what they said was, here's a picture of a software company where at least 2 or 3 days a week, everybody was in the office and they all had their stuff at their desk. And then in the off days, they traveled to customer sites or, they traveled to different locations. In this instance, the IRS said, actually, that company had the ability to telework. Everything that was done could be done either when they traveled, so obviously they were portable, and even though they typically worked in their offices, because they could do everything they were doing from their computers, they didn't require any physical equipment in the office to do their jobs. They had the ability to telework and therefore were not affected by the government shutdown. Again, they go on to say, if it took 2 weeks to get everybody the equipment they needed, then during that time. But they were very clear that even if it was your regular course of business to have 90% of your workforce or more in the office a couple days a week, that was not substantial enough to get you to that partial shutdown. So, whereas we've seen a lot of legislation really broadening, when you can take a credit and really opening up funds, what feels like in some cases a lot of funds, right? In this case, I feel like the notice was sort of harnessing that a little bit and sort of shutting it down where you could grab it. And that was one example of a company that could telework wasn't partially suspended, even if they kind of thought they were up to that point. So it's a great question.
Well, so I know there's a ton of FAQs in there, and I think that, one of the big areas that we talked a little bit about last week, but I think it's important because so many people are in this boat here, is the interplay of the retention credit and the PPP. So what are a couple just reminders here that people need to keep in the top of their head as they're working through this?
Absolutely. What a great question. So, and I think Jack did a phenomenal job last week. And Jack and I spent a lot of time. I'm lucky enough to be able to talk to him during the week about what we need to keep in mind. So but the big thing, and it all frames around, you may not double dip, right? You may not use the same wages for forgiveness that you use for the employee retention credit. Hugely important to remember. So, what do we do if we've already applied for forgiveness? The notice gave examples. They said, look, if you applied for forgiveness using only wages, but you included a buffer, so like you had $200,000 of PPP loans, you put in $270,000 of wages for forgiveness, you could carve out those $70,000. They said if you had, $200,000 of PPP loans, you didn't use expenses, but you could have, and you put in $200,000 of wages with nothing left over, you're out of luck. You could not then add back that, so then you can't take the retention credit. And then the third scenario was if you had wages left over that you didn't include in anything, you could also grab those and use them for the retention credit. But it was very specific. You really wanted to take a look at the wages. You wanted to look at the opportunities where you might have a chance to carve some out, especially if now you realize you are affected by a partial shutdown. Because a lot of people were saying, were we, weren't we? Probably not, because we actually made money. Then all of a sudden they weren't thinking about it. But I mean, to the good points that our PPP team has really brought to life, it's okay to press pause. It's also okay to press pause on the retention credit, right? Because the new law, actually more breaking news, the new law gives us 5 years to look back and claim that credit. Initially, we were thinking, oh, we have 3 years to file the 941X or, file the catch up, however they're going to regulate that to take it. The new law, I was actually reading right before we came on, there's just a nugget in there that says you've got 5 years to take a look at this. So you don't have 5 years for your forgiveness application, but it is appropriate to press pause so that you can at least think this stuff through and get to the right answer for you and for your organization.
Yeah, so I think those are all really good considerations. And I know you and Jack and Chastity Wilson wrote a really nice article that's out on our website that summarizes really those three scenarios too, to really help people think through that. And it's about a 2-minute read, so I think it's really helpful. But what are some of the best industry opportunities that you see that are taking advantage of maybe this credit, and people should be on the lookout for it?
Yeah, that's such a great question too. So, Leslie, as you know, I was very fortunate to have a conversation yesterday with our chief industry officer at the firm for private industries, and we were talking about just this thing. So Sam and I were saying, look, franchises, like, let's really take a look and dive deep into this where we can peel off and identify that 10%, because there are a lot of ways that if you have a partial suspension in one franchise, you can maybe apply for everything. So that's something that we really want people to take a look at. We've been finding some of these archdiocese parishes, are qualifying for the credit. There's so many, but I would say let's start there. Let's take a look at ourselves and see, and then broaden our reach and have the good conversations. And we are going to have Chastity and I are working on some articles too, just about the new law and the families first as well. So lots of good stuff to just keep looking for. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this with you guys today.
Absolutely. And I know we have a bunch of questions coming in, so you've set us up just phenomenally to pivot over to Todd, and we're going to let him come in now, but we'll keep you around for any questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Todd, it is great to have you joining us, and we've got breaking news unbelievably on the PPP side that we're going to start with here too. So, I think we should start with the fact that the current round of PPP lending is approaching the March 31st deadline, and we've been hearing all kinds of rumors, the rumor mill, if you will, that this deadline is going to get pushed. So why don't you bring us up to speed on the rumor mill here?
Sure, that sounds great, Leslie. I can do that. Because you're right. Overall, there's been a lot of concern, right, with the March 31st deadline for PPP for this round of loan applications approaching and what's going to happen. I think there's widespread support. There's a lot of people who still need funds, and there's funds still available. So what can be done to expand the program, right? And while there's widespread I'll say support for extending it, say, to a certain date, like June 30th. What we heard seems like, or what seems to be coming reality, is a bill introduced to, I would say, take the approach of NAGLE, the National Association Government Guaranteed Government Lenders. They proposed something like this, and it is to bifurcate the deadline. And so what I saw would bifurcate that deadline, and it would be nice to see something like that. Why? Because if you take that deadline and create two deadlines out of it, establishing one deadline for submitting applications and then another for getting approval from the SBA for the loan, right? It prevents the lenders from having to set their own deadlines, because otherwise, or set their own timeframes. Because under the current March 31st deadline, they have to look at their backlog of who they've got in the backlog, who might be on hold, what their processes might be, and they have to make a decision as to when they might stop taking applications in order to get people across the finish line, that they can go start to finish before that March 31st deadline. And so I think the opportunity to have a bifurcated deadline levels the playing field for everybody, and kind of everybody should have the same, be able to submit applications to the same date, which, if I'm hearing right, sounds like about the end of May or early June. And then they would have the month of June, lenders would have to process those applications that are submitted and get people approved by SBA. Much orderly and more consistent process. So I think that breaking news is good news for folks that are still applying to the program or in the process of being evaluated or reviewed as part of the program.
Yeah, I think it's good news too. Like you said, it brings a little bit more order to everything. I also think it's really interesting that you mentioned that lenders, right now might be establishing their own deadlines with when people have to cut off for this. There's been some other, reports and reading out there that are stating that lenders might not accept application forms right now that allow some applicants to obtain higher loan amounts. And I'm curious, could those decisions be similar to what you've just described? And, doesn't that create an issue for some borrowers?
Yeah, that's a great point, a great question. You might be referring to those recent reports too that some of the larger banks might be saying, or larger lending institutions, let's just say, have said that there's the new Form Cs, the 84C or 83C for the folks that are first draws, or the SD Form C for those that file Schedule C for second draws, that might allow them to have access to more funds, or maybe even get funds through the program, and that some lenders have said we're not going to accept those new forms, right? And those, so on when you look at that, those folks, there might be a couple reasons for doing that, right? Maybe it is, like I said, based on their backlog, maybe, but every time a new form comes out, there's also system changes and process changes that need to occur. And hopefully with that March 31st deadline, if that really does go away, it opens things up, and people will revisit, or lenders will revisit those decisions and start accepting those new forms and make those investments or make those changes to their process. But just in case they don't, let me run down a couple common scenarios, I think, for folks that are sitting in the queue or still looking at applying to the program, and what they might be thinking about if for some reason, as we keep approaching this March 31st deadline, it holds. So I had three different scenarios. I had the folks that haven't applied yet at all. And if their lender will accept the new form, great. New form, go with the new form if it's to your advantage. But if your lender's not accepting the new form, then you have to look at, do I submit an old form or do I go to another lender, right? And the old form may get you less proceeds. Going to a new lender, though, has some compliance constraints with it. They might have to do a little more due diligence on you in accepting you in, and there's not a lot of time for that, right? So that's one scenario. And none of these, they're all facts and circumstances. So there's no general answer on what to do if you're in these queues. But I know CLA advisors can help you do that. Folks at CLA can help you work through that process if you have more questions. But if you're in the queue, currently in the queue, do you give up your place in line? And do you go back and fill out a new form and start over? Or do you keep going through the process? Again, a cost benefit analysis depends on how much the new form might benefit you and how much time you have left to the deadline. And then the third scenario, which might surprise you a bit, is if you're all the way through the process, actually approved by SBA, but you weren't included by the lender on the 1502, it might actually be easier for you to go back and get the additional funds, because that process, then the process of submission to SBA, there's several cues or checks up front on data fields. And if you've navigated those successfully already, it may be not too bad to get through the new form review, because you'll know that submission process is all clear. You'll be set up for that well. So you may actually be able to get that through that process faster if you've already been through the queue, and your lender will pull back that application if it's in that stage. So I just thought a couple common scenarios as folks struggle with while we're still under the current deadline that they may struggle with.
Yeah, so those are all really, I think, helpful backgrounds and things to know under that current deadline. And I think another thing that's really important to talk about, as we've had all of these sweeping changes and the trickle down effect of that, is forgiveness. So pivoting to PPP forgiveness, last Friday, the SBA stopped accepting old forgiveness forms, really because forms have changed, right? And they're only accepting these updated forms that were now made available in January. So what observations do you have now on how that's impacting borrowers that are applying for forgiveness?
It's been a great advantage on the side of ease of that review process, because as I said, there's a review process and that kind of electronic submission process. The review process is so much easier for those that can use the S form, that are eligible to use that simple S form. The side on submission, though, actually with that change on March 5th, it got a little more onerous to get through that process, because now the data checks that I was talking about, say, in the application process, or that some have experienced in the application process, they're now in place on the forgiveness end. So things like EIN, Social Security number, things matching up with SBA databases and searches, there can be different holds or more holds placed in that forgiveness process. But from the borrower perspective, at least the forms have become so much more simplified and quicker to file, and hopefully those data issues will continue to get worked out and they won't be subject to those holds on the forgiveness side. But overall, I think a very positive thing for everybody involved in the process.
Well, thank you so much for those updates. Now what we're going to do is take a couple of the questions that we have seen coming through the chat. And I want to start with one that's related to the retention credit. So we've got a really good question out there that says, and I think this one will be for you, Jen, does a cash basis taxpayer have to make an adjustment in 2020 for any refunds applied for and received in 2021 for the retention credit? So obviously there can be adjustments under 280C. What do you think about that?
Well, it's not only what I think, it's what's actually stated in the code about this one. And we were just laughing about that. So it was great when I saw, and a couple of people had voted it up in priority. This is not going to be great news for people or what they want to hear. And that's why I feel like I've actually, you know me, I don't argue with anybody. And I've been actually engaging in some tough conversations, because the answer to this is, if it's the 2020 credit, even if you are a cash basis taxpayer, if you claim it, you do have to adjust that wage expense in 2020 to reflect the 2020 credit, so that you can't take the credit and the deduction on the same wages. Now, that does create timing issues, right? Because a lot of people are like, well, I don't have my credit, and this is going to actually effectively boost my income for tax purposes. And that seems to be a struggle. You know, my best answer is something that you have said in almost every conversation that we've had, except for our fun ones offline, and that is, extend is your friend. And now is the time to be aware of it. Even if you extend, file it on March 16th so that you can get those superseded returns in there. Do that, or calculate the credit if you don't want to extend, even if you haven't filed yet, so that you don't have to go through the amendment process. For some people, it doesn't matter. For others, it's costly, it's tricky, and you've got multiple K1s that are affected. And so there's a lot of heartache around that. So this year, more than ever, extend is your friend. If, and those are your words that I love to say back to you and anybody who will listen. So that's what I would say. But the answer to the question, and the reason why that is important, is because if it is a 2020 credit, it has to be impacted and reflected in your wage expense for 2020.
I think that's a great just insight that you have. We have another question related to aggregation and the retention credit, which, you know, is a topic that I sure love. So it says, you know, what are the aggregation rules for the retention credit, and are they the same for the PPP? So maybe we can tag team this question. What do you think?
I say let's do it.
Okay.
let's do it together. So I'll start it.
Okay.
And you know, so for ERC, the rule is for aggregation, you know, follow 52A or B, depending on whether you're a partnership. You know, if you have more than 50% ownership or control, that's going to trigger aggregation. You know, and then there's some brother-sister rules. We do believe you can carve out, and Leslie, you actually wrote a great article on this. You can carve out international employees when you are aggregating, but they are different rules for PPP. So let me ask you, my friend, what are the differences, and can you articulate some of those differences that are not quite as simple as laid out in just 52A and B?
Well, I think that's right. And so we had definitely commented on it in terms of the global and the foreign context. But, you know, I would say in general, the PPP casts a wider net for aggregation, where you're looking at certain affiliation arrangements where it might be common management, common control, and other arrangements that cast a wider net. When you're looking at it from an ERC type of arrangement, while there can be a PEO or a leased employee arrangement that might snag you, generally it's a controlled group arrangement in the tax code that's going to get you, with some carve outs like you mentioned, for foreign companies where they don't have effectively connected foreign source income and you get to pull out the foreign pieces of it. So I definitely think that they are different. It seems like it's easier to get to maybe a different and better answer under the retention credit is my read on that. But anyway, you want to tread carefully there. So thank you for that. Well, let's pivot to Todd because we have a question related to the turnaround time for PPP loans, and that is, what is the average turnaround time for banks to process PPP loan applications? And also, with March 31st deadline to get approved, how does that factor in right now for the loan application, especially because they haven't extended this deadline?
Sure, sure. It's hard to put an average time on that turnaround, but let me attempt. So the two processes that I talked about before, the actual review process of the application and then the submission process to SBA. The review process really depends on the organization of the applicant, right? But I would say very, very few, a small percentage of the applications actually go through without some sort of back and forth review, question, modification, and maybe an updated application. So I think you have to expect that that would take, say, 7 days. Now, that's just a guess. That's not based on any facts, right? It's just probably 7 to 10 days is probably a good barometer for that. And I would say that last process, that process of submission to SBA, that can take, and getting approval, that can take a day or two. It can take a long time. If you get caught up in those holds or those data fields, that can really string that process along. That's why it's really hard to give an average. But if I said you're typically well organized, let's just say the goal would be to get you through probably in about 7 to 10 days from beginning to end. And then on the application side, view it as a shutting down of that SBA accepting those applications on March 31st at 11:59 p.m. That's when they're not going to accept. So it has to get in, get there, and get approved from them by the end of that day. So that's how I'd answer that last question, Leslie.
Awesome. Well, thank you for those insights. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today, but I want to thank both Todd, you and Jen. I want to thank our moderators who have been live with us answering those questions in the chat. And I want to thank all of our viewers for your engagement and your questions. We want to encourage you to register and engage with us. Join us next week where we're going to unpack the new $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. We love having you be part of the conversation with us, and we definitely look forward to seeing you next week. But until then, stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie.